All right, so a couple things you guys need to know for tomorrow's exam about monetary policy. We normally would be sitting in a circle in this unit and somebody would be wearing the red, white, and blue floppy hat I have in front and play the Federal Reserve. Some of you would have been assigned a bankroll. Some of you would have been like Susie Shopper and Wanda Once a Lot. So we need to talk about so the velocity of money looks at how many times a unit of currency, $1, $5, $10, whatever, flows through the economy and is used by the various members of society. Normally I'd have you pull out some money, or I usually get a bunch of ones and we look at the dollar bill and it will tell you by code where the dollar was issued from. So for example, Colorado, our Federal Reserve Bank is out of Kansas City and the letter code would be J10. If your money has a 1 on it, that's Boston. L12 is San Francisco. So money is issued in different parts of the country through the Federal Reserve. And when we see a high turnover, usually the classroom, we have a lot from Chicago G7, Atlanta's Common F6. We don't usually get a lot from New York for some reason. Anyway, so the faster money travels, the higher the velocity, the higher turnover, the more transactions in which it's being used. The healthier the economy, the richer the citizens, the more vibrant the financial system. So right now, our velocity of money is probably pretty low because of the pandemic, and money's not turning as fast because we're not using cash as much or as often. All right, so the Federal Reserve determines the percentage of money banks have to keep on hand or in its vaults. So think about where you bank. I happen to bank at First Bank. My guess is some of you are at Wells Fargo, KeyBank, Chase Bank, etc. Those banks are all businesses, and the Federal Reserve oversees their activities. Those excess reserves is the extra money that banks are allowed to loan out, and therefore they use that extra reserve money to earn a profit. So banks are a business. The Federal Reserve, which is also called the central bank, the bankers bank, the Fed, they are in charge of the banking system. So they oversee, they regulate local banks. Okay, so here's Albert's Bank, and it's the balance sheet. It's also called the T account in accounting. You've already gone over this, so hopefully this is a review. But assets are things of value. Liabilities is the debt you owe. Some of you will have college loans or car loans or home loans someday, and that's a liability. You owe that back. And then your owner's equity is the leftover. That's your value. So think about Jeff Bezos. His owner's equity is probably crazy high because his assets are way, way larger than his liabilities. On the right, under demand deposits, that's the checking account. So when you take your money into the bank, it's a liability for the bank because they owe it back to you. So they don't get to just keep your money, but you put that money in the bank and they have a certain amount that they can then loan out. What is the required reserve ratio? Well, that's pretty easy to figure out on this. I just take 20,000 divided by 100,000 and I get 20%. So that's how you find out the required reserve ratio. You can double check your math. $100,000 times 20% equals $20,000. How much total money can the Bank of Albert loan out? Well, if they have to keep $20,000 in reserves, out of that $100,000, they can loan out $80,000. Now we already see they have loans of $50,000 out. So I know that they have, their excess reserves is $30,000 because 50,000 plus 20,000 plus 30,000 equals 100,000. So then I'm balancing, and that $30,000 is their excess reserves, which means they are able to loan that out to make a profit. Okay, let's say you bank at the Bank of Albert, and the Federal Reserve sets a required reserve ratio of 20%, and you go to the bank and you deposit $1,000. We're going to see how that ripples through the banking system with the money multiplier. The money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio, similar to the regular multiplier. So it would be 1 over 20%, which equals 5. And you go in there with that $1,000. They have to keep $200 in required reserve in their vault. So that's 1,000 times 20%. And that means they have $800 they can loan out. So let's say Wanda Once a Lot needs a loan. She goes in for $800, but she doesn't bank at the Bank of Albert. She banks at Bob's Big Bank. So she goes to Bob's Big Bank and gets that money. It gets deposited in Bob's Big Bank. 20% of that $800 has to be in required reserve. So Bob's bank has to keep $160 in required reserve. The excess reserve is $640, and then that bank can loan out $640. That gets loaned out through somebody goes to that bank needing a loan for a new car, we'll say, and they go to Cash Bank to buy the car. That $640 gets deposited at Cash Bank, and then of the $640, 128 is in required reserve, 512 is excess reserve, and then that 512 goes to Dwight's Bank. So it ripples through the economy. So we take 1 over the required reserve, the 1 over 20% is 5, and then we multiply 1,000 times 5, and the entire money supply could be increased by up to 5,000. Now this is assuming that every bank is loaning out the max of their excess reserves, which most banks don't. This is assuming a lot of things. This is the potential of how much the money supply can change. So here are a couple practice ones. If the required reserve ratio is 10% and excess reserves are 50,000, we take 1 over 10%, which equals 10. We then take 50,000 times 10, and the money supply could increase by 500,000. If the required reserve ratio is 40%, excess reserves are 50,000, 1 over 40% is 2.5. 2.5 times 50,000 is 125,000. All right, so here we're looking at the money market graph, and you'll notice if the Federal Reserve goes from having a 20% required reserve and lowers it to 10%, the potential to the money supply is pretty big because of that money multiplier. And so let's say we're at money supply 1, and it shifts to the right. Oh, excuse me, it's MS to MS1. What's happening to the nominal interest rate? It's going down. So the interest rate would go down, and this encourages more people to borrow money. So the Federal Reserve would lower the required reserve ratio for commercial banks in a pandemic or in a recession or any time that they want to stimulate the economy, because the lower the interest rate, the more likely it is consumers and business investment will increase. And they want to stimulate aggregate demand because we've got this GDP gap. We are not producing to our full potential, and we want to stimulate commerce. We want to stimulate purchasing, and we do that, or the Federal Reserve does that through changing the money supply. So a rightward shift of the money supply lowers the interest rate and encourages spending. So just one more time, during a recession, we have low GDP, low production, we have high unemployment. So the Federal Reserve or central bank or Fed would want to lower interest rate. So they're more likely to reduce the required reserve ratio, meaning banks can make more loans, and we'd have a greater supply. So the opposite is true as well. So if we have high demand pull inflation, meaning GDP's just going gangbusters, and we have really low unemployment, which we had that going on January and last year, and the Federal Reserve would want a higher interest rate to control inflation. So they would do the opposite. So to have a higher interest rate, they're going to tell banks, hey, you know what? We told you before your required reserve was 10%. Well, now we're going to increase it to 25%. So they're telling banks, slow down, don't make loans. We're going to have a higher interest rate. So the supply of money would be shifting to the left, and you'd see the interest rate go up. And they do that during demand pull inflation so that we slow down the velocity of money because it's just going too fast. We're having too rapid of inflation. So that's one of the ways the Federal Reserve works on controlling the interest rate. Next week, we'll look at the discount rate as well as open market operations. So Friday's test will only be over the required reserve ratio and this portion of the Federal Reserve.